Maybe it started the winter my knees began aching on the stairs, or maybe it began years earlier and I simply refused to acknowledge it. At 63, I had learned that some truths can sit quietly in the corner of a marriage for decades, waiting patiently until you're finally ready to see them. I wasn't ready for a very long time. Before we continue, welcome back to the Quiet Revenge Stories channel. If you enjoy real-life family drama, quiet revenge stories, and powerful lessons about self-respect and boundaries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now let's get back to what happened next. I ran a small translation consultancy from our home in Oakville. Most of my work involved legal documents, though hospitals in Mississauga occasionally sent over medical files that needed careful and precise handling. My husband of 31 years never asked what I was working on. He asked what we were having for dinner, whether I had called the snow removal company, or if the accountant had sent the quarterly remittance paperwork. What he never asked about was the language that lived inside my head like a second heartbeat. 30 years earlier, when I told him I had spent my junior year at university in Seoul through an exchange program at Queen's, he laughed and said, "That's adorable. You'll never use it up here." After that, I stopped mentioning it. And when you stop mentioning something long enough, it becomes a secret whether you intended it to or not. My husband's name was Gordon. He was 67 years old and a partner at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm on Bay Street. During the previous 6 years, his business had increasingly shifted toward cross-Pacific investments, which meant many of his clients came from Seoul, Busan, and occasionally Incheon. Gordon was enormously proud of the Korean he had learned through evening classes at the University of Toronto and a private tutor. He sprinkled Korean phrases into conversations the way some men casually mention expensive wines, confident that no one around them knew enough to challenge them. The problem was that his Korean was terrible, his accent was poor, his grammar was worse. But Gordon possessed enough confidence to compensate for all of it, and in Toronto's business world, confidence often carried people farther than competence. I never corrected him. Early in our marriage, I had tried exactly once. I remember doing it gently, offering a small suggestion during a conversation. Gordon responded by going silent for the rest of the evening and sleeping in the guest room. I was 34 at the time and still believed marriage was something you carefully tended like a garden, so I apologized. I apologized for knowing something he didn't. After that, I folded my Korean away and kept it out of sight. Our daughter Elise was 30 now and living in Vancouver with her husband, a thoughtful man who worked for a forestry consultancy. When she was around 12, she once asked why I never spoke Korean around her father. I remember standing at the kitchen sink looking out toward the maple tree in our backyard and answering as honestly as I could. "Your father likes to be the one who knows things." She nodded as though that explanation made perfect sense. Children often understand more than adults realize. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, near the end of October. Gordon walked into the kitchen while I was reviewing a translation completed by one of my junior associates. He dropped his briefcase onto the island and announced that he needed me at a client dinner on Friday evening at the Shangri-La downtown. I looked up in surprise. During 31 years of marriage, Gordon had invited me to exactly 4 business dinners. The last one had been almost a decade earlier. "It's a big one," he explained while pouring himself a glass of Niagara Riesling from the refrigerator. "Mr. Park and his wife are flying in from Seoul. He's overseeing a $400 million industrial portfolio deal near Pearson. His wife wanted to meet the wives. Cultural thing." "I see." "Wear the green dress," he continued. "The one with the sleeves. And for God's sake, don't try speaking Korean. I'll handle all of that. You just smile, look like a nice Canadian housewife. Nod when I nod, laugh when I laugh. Easy." For a moment, I nearly laughed. The reaction rose into my throat before I forced it back down. "I'll do my best, dear. Good girl." He kissed the top of my head the way someone might pat a loyal dog and left the kitchen carrying his wine. I remained exactly where I was for a long time after he disappeared. Eventually, I went upstairs and removed the green dress from the closet. I laid it across the bed and stood there looking at it. My thoughts drifted from the language I had hidden for 3 decades to the mortgage that was nearly paid off to the commercial properties Gordon managed through a numbered Ontario corporation, and to the countless documents I had signed over the years because someone assured me everything was perfectly normal. Then I thought about Brianna, 28 years old. Gordon's secretary, a woman who had called our house 3 separate times during the previous year using a tone that felt far too familiar. I thought about all of it, and for the first time in a very long while, I stopped pushing those thoughts away. Friday arrived cold and bright, one of those late October days when the sunlight cuts across everything at a low angle and makes the world appear sharper than it really is. That morning, I booked an appointment at a salon on Lakeshore, not because Gordon had requested it, but because I wanted to look into a mirror and recognize the woman looking back at me. The stylist was a Korean-Canadian woman named Yuna, whom I had known for years. She was one of only a handful of people in my life who knew about my years in Seoul and the language I had quietly carried with me ever since. As she worked, we spoke comfortably in Korean, the conversation flowing as naturally as breathing. At one point, she paused and met my eyes in the mirror. "You look like someone who's made a decision," she said softly. I smiled. "I think I have." She didn't ask what decision I meant. She simply nodded and continued working. By 6 o'clock, Gordon arrived to pick me up. He was already wearing confidence the way some men wear expensive cologne, and during the drive into Toronto, he spent most of the time briefing me as though I were a supporting character in an event built around him. Mr. Park, he explained, was 69 years old school wealthy, and connected to some of the most influential investment circles in South Korea. Mrs. Park was a former art dealer who now served on the board of a major museum foundation in Seoul. "They value family," Gordon said as we stopped at a red light near University Avenue. "They value stability, discretion, and long marriages, which is why you're an asset tonight." I turned toward him. "An asset?" He grinned. "Look at us, 31 years married, stable home, respectable family. The old man will love it. I'll do my part. That's all I ask." The Shangri-La restaurant occupied part of the hotel's elegant lobby level, one of those places where every detail seems carefully engineered to make guests feel slightly wealthier and more attractive than they really are. The lighting was warm, the service flawless, and the atmosphere carried the polished confidence of people accustomed to expensive conversations. Mr. and Mrs. Park were already seated when we arrived. Mr. Park stood immediately and greeted Gordon with a handshake and a small bow. Gordon returned the gesture, though he bowed a little too deeply, a mistake that immediately caught my attention. Mrs. Park studied me quietly. Like many older Korean women, she seemed capable of forming an opinion within seconds. Her eyes moved across my dress, my posture, and my expression before settling into something that resembled approval. I bowed to her at exactly the proper angle for greeting an elder I respected. The reaction was subtle, but I felt Gordon stiffen beside me. When I straightened, I smiled pleasantly, as though nothing unusual had happened. We took our seats. Drinks were ordered. The first 20 minutes passed in careful, polite English conversation. We discussed travel, Toronto weather, and the differences between Canada and South Korea. Mrs. Park asked about Elise, and I told her about our daughter, her life in Vancouver, and her marriage. She listened attentively before asking whether we had grandchildren yet. "Not yet," I replied. "But we're hopeful." She smiled knowingly. "Patience. Children arrive when they're ready." The conversation flowed easily after that. Mr. Park occasionally asked Gordon questions about the Toronto real estate market, while Mrs. Park and I discussed gardens, books, and travel. Everything felt cordial and professional. Then, perhaps 20 minutes into dinner, Mr. Park leaned toward Gordon and spoke in Korean. "Shall we speak more comfortably? My English is becoming tiring tonight." Gordon's face lit up instantly. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Of course," he replied in heavily accented Korean. "Please forgive my poor Korean." Mr. Park politely dismissed the apology. Beside me, Mrs. Park turned and addressed me in English. "I hope you don't mind, dear. The men will discuss business. We may have to entertain ourselves." "Not at all," I replied. I lifted my water glass. I took a small sip, and I allowed my expression to settle into the pleasant neutral look I had practiced earlier that afternoon. Then the conversation shifted completely into Korean, and I understood every single word. At first, the discussion remained focused on business. They talked about industrial zoning near Pearson Airport vacancy rates, logistics facilities, and a parcel of land in Brampton that had recently become available. Gordon's Korean was exactly as bad as I remembered. He mixed formal and informal speech, misused honorifics, and occasionally phrased things in ways that sounded awkward to a native speaker. Mr. Park never corrected him. He was too polite for that. But I noticed the tiny tightening of his jaw every time Gordon made another mistake. Meanwhile, Mrs. Park and I carried on a completely different conversation in English. She asked about my garden, and I told her about the tomatoes I grew every summer behind our house in Oakville. She described the balcony garden she maintained in Seoul, and we exchanged stories about stubborn plants and unpredictable weather. Beneath that calm conversation, however, the men's voices continued in Korean. And I listened. Every word, every mistake, every assumption. And before long, the discussion began moving away from business and into something far more revealing. For the first 10 minutes after the conversation shifted into Korean, everything remained strictly professional. They discussed industrial properties, airport-adjacent developments, vacancy projections, and investment structures. I sat quietly listening while Mrs. Park and I talked about gardening, occasionally nodding when appropriate, and allowing Gordon to enjoy what he clearly believed was a triumphant evening. The problem was that Gordon became more confident with every passing minute. Confidence had always been his weakness. The more comfortable he felt, the more likely he was to mistake arrogance for charm. Eventually, Mr. Park moved the conversation away from numbers and contracts. In a casual tone, he remarked that Gordon and I had been married for 31 years, which was an achievement in itself. He added that in Korea, a long marriage was often viewed as a form of wealth. The moment those words left his mouth, I felt something tighten in my stomach. I knew Gordon too well. I knew the laugh that followed before it even happened. And right on cue, he laughed. It was the same laugh I had heard for decades whenever he believed he was about to impress someone. Wealth, he said in Korean. Yes, well, let's just say the accounting on that investment is more complicated than it appears. Mr. Park tilted his head slightly. He didn't smile. Gordon continued anyway. Between us, a man in my position needs more than one ledger. My wife is a good woman, but she's not a young woman anymore. There are other arrangements in my life. You understand. The silence that followed was immediate. Not empty. Not uncertain. A distinctly Korean silence. The kind that already contains an answer. Mr. Park said nothing. Unfortunately, Gordon interpreted that silence as encouragement. He leaned forward slightly. I have a young woman at the office, he continued, 28 years old, Brianna. Very understanding, very discreet. My wife doesn't know, of course. There's no reason for her to know. She has her translation hobby, her garden, and a comfortable life. I felt my fingers tighten around my water glass. Across from me, Mrs. Park continued discussing balcony plants as though nothing unusual was happening. Her voice remained calm, steady, composed. Yet something in her eyes told me she was listening to every word as carefully as I was. Gordon kept talking. The more he spoke, the worse it became. As for the finances, he said, lowering his voice slightly, I've protected myself quite well. The Oakville house is in her name, but the commercial properties, the shares, and the offshore holdings are elsewhere. Everything important sits inside a numbered company structure. She signed the paperwork years ago without reading it. Then he chuckled. Actually chuckled. She never reads the paperwork. I kept my face perfectly still. Years of translation work had taught me how to control my reactions. When your profession requires handling legal disputes, medical emergencies, and sensitive negotiations, you learn quickly that composure is a skill. At that moment, it became invaluable. Gordon continued explaining how once the current transaction closed, he would have enough money to leave quietly. He mentioned Palm Springs. He mentioned Brianna. He mentioned plans for a future he had apparently been constructing behind my back for years. Not once did he hesitate. Not once did he wonder whether the woman sitting 3 feet away might understand him perfectly. Meanwhile, Mrs. Park was telling me about Jasmine. She described the plant she kept on her apartment balcony in Seoul and how its fragrance filled the evening air during the summer months. "That must be beautiful," I said. "It reminds my husband of his grandmother's house," she replied softly. Across the table, Gordon was discussing offshore entities and hidden commissions. The contrast was almost surreal. Then the conversation took an even darker turn. "So Mr. Park," Gordon said, grinning broadly, "if we structure this transaction through the offshore vehicle we've discussed, I can ensure everyone leaves the table very satisfied." For the first time all evening, Mr. Park responded slowly. Very slowly. "You have told me a great deal tonight, Mr. Lindstrom." Gordon smiled. "Only what is useful to our partnership." "Yes," Mr. Park said quietly. "I see." The words sounded ordinary. The meaning behind them did not. A moment later, I felt something unexpected. Mrs. Park's hand briefly touched mine beneath the table. I turned toward her. She wasn't looking at me. Her attention appeared focused entirely on her husband, but her hand remained on mine for a second longer than necessary. And in that instant, I understood. She knew. She knew I understood Korean. She knew I had heard every word, and she knew exactly how difficult it was for me to sit there and listen. Her hand squeezed mine gently before withdrawing. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The main course arrived shortly afterward. Gordon remained expansive and self-satisfied, convinced he had impressed one of the most important clients of his career. Mr. Park asked a few additional questions about the proposed transaction, and Gordon answered each one eagerly. Mrs. Park guided our conversation toward safer topics such as travel museums and the approaching Toronto winter. I answered politely. I ate my salmon. I drank half a glass of Riesling. And I waited. Because after 31 years of marriage, I had finally learned the difference between reacting and preparing. When dessert arrived and coffee was poured, I realized the moment had come. Mr. Park set down his spoon. The waiter stepped away from the table. The conversation paused naturally. I looked across at my husband. Then, in precise, flawless Korean, shaped by decades of study practice and silence, I spoke for the first time that evening. "Gordon, darling," I said calmly, "I think perhaps I should respond to a few of the things you've said tonight." And suddenly the entire room stopped breathing. I cannot adequately describe the expression on Gordon's face. It wasn't merely surprise. It wasn't confusion. It was the look of a man watching an entire version of reality collapse in front of him. The color drained from his face so quickly that for a moment I wondered whether he might actually be ill. Across the table, Mr. Park carefully lowered his coffee cup onto its saucer. Mrs. Park lifted hers and took a small sip. Neither of them appeared shocked. If anything, they looked relieved. Sarah Gordon began in English, his voice cracking. I ignored him. For 31 years I had listened. Tonight he could listen. Still speaking in Korean, I turned toward Mr. and Mrs. Park. "First, I would like to thank you both for your patience and your kindness this evening. I also want to apologize for the uncomfortable position in which you have been placed. It was never my intention to deceive anyone. However, when my husband informed me that I would be unable to understand the conversation, I decided that for once in my life, it might be useful to simply listen." The silence around the table deepened. Even the sounds from nearby diners seemed distant. "My husband does not know that I spent my junior year at Yonsei University," I continued. "He does not know that I have worked professionally as a translator for 26 years, specializing primarily in legal and medical documents. He does not know that maintaining my certification requires professional-level fluency. He does not know these things because he never asked." I paused briefly. "He was told once many years ago. He simply decided the information wasn't important enough to remember." Mr. Park gave a small nod. Nothing more. Yet somehow that tiny gesture felt more respectful than anything Gordon had offered me in years. Then I continued. "Regarding the young woman at the office, I have been aware of the situation for approximately 14 months. I possess documentation. Gordon made a choking sound. I still didn't look at him. Regarding the offshore accounts, the numbered Ontario Corporation, and the asset transfers, I became concerned 2 years ago when certain financial records failed to reconcile properly. As a result, I retained the services of my own forensic accountant, who reviewed the available documentation. Mr. Park's eyebrows rose slightly. Mrs. Park remained perfectly still. I should also mention I continued that my attorney believes several of those transfers may prove difficult to defend during disclosure proceedings. The Cayman account in particular is likely to attract attention from parties whose attention my husband would probably prefer to avoid. I lifted my coffee cup, took a sip, then set it down again. As for Palm Springs, I sincerely wish him well, though I suspect Brianna may ultimately discover that retirement there will be somewhat less luxurious than she has been led to expect. For the first time, I turned and looked directly at Gordon. His mouth was hanging open. His eyes were fixed on me as though he were staring at a complete stranger. Perhaps he was. I switched to English. My voice remained calm, steady, controlled. I filed for divorce this morning, Gordon. The words landed like a physical blow. My lawyer is Margaret Chan at Torkin Mains. You will be served on Monday. The locks on the Oakville house were changed at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Your belongings have been packed and placed in the garage. I suggest you make alternative sleeping arrangements tonight. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Gordon tried to speak. Failed. Tried again. Nothing emerged. Across the table, Mr. Park finally spoke. This time in English. Slowly. Deliberately, with the authority of a man who had spent decades judging character. Mr. Lindstrom, he said, during 42 years in business, I have learned many things. One lesson stands above all others. The way a man speaks about his wife when he believes she cannot hear him is often the clearest measure of who he truly is. Gordon stared at him. Mr. Park continued, Because of what I heard tonight, I will not be entering into any business arrangement with your firm. The words seemed to strike harder than the divorce announcement. Yet Mr. Park wasn't finished. I will also be sharing my observations with several colleagues who have approached me regarding similar opportunities. I suspect your professional calendar may become considerably less crowded in the months ahead. Gordon looked physically ill. His shoulders sagged. The confidence that had carried him through the evening evaporated completely. Then Mr. Park turned toward me. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. His expression softened immediately. Mrs. Lindstrom, my wife and I would be honored if you would join us for coffee tomorrow morning. There are several matters we would like to discuss with you that may prove mutually beneficial. I inclined my head respectfully. The proper depth. The same way I had greeted Mrs. Park earlier that evening. I would be honored. Beside him, Mrs. Park reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand once more. This time she didn't let go immediately. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. None of us needed to. Everything important had already been said. Eventually, the waiter arrived with the bill. Mr. Park insisted on paying. Gordon didn't object. In fact, Gordon didn't say anything at all. He simply sat there, still. Silent, smaller than I had ever seen him. A short time later, I stood from the table and smoothed the green dress Gordon had specifically instructed me to wear. I picked up my handbag, thanked Mr. and Mrs. Park in flawless Korean for a lovely evening, and walked through the elegant lobby of the Shangri-La. Outside University Avenue was cold and bright beneath the city lights. I hailed a cab, gave my address, and watched Toronto pass by through the window. When I finally arrived home, I unlocked the front door using a key Gordon no longer possessed. The house was quiet. I set down my purse, walked into the kitchen, and sat at the table where I had spent so many years making myself smaller. Then I cried. Not for long, perhaps 10 minutes, just long enough to mourn the marriage I thought I had. When the tears stopped, I stood up and put the kettle on. A few minutes later, I sat back down with a mug of red rose tea, the same tea I had been drinking since I was 19 years old. For the first time in decades, the silence in the house felt different. It no longer felt lonely. It felt free. The divorce took 14 months. Margaret Chan turned out to be exactly as competent as I had hoped when I hired her. More importantly, the forensic accountant I retained long before the Shangri-La dinner had been extraordinarily thorough. Years of financial records, corporate filings, bank statements, and property transfers were examined piece by piece until a complete picture emerged, and that picture looked very different from the one Gordon had spent years presenting. The numbered Ontario corporation that Gordon believed would shield most of the marital assets was eventually unwound under court supervision. Commercial properties were appraised, ownership structures were reviewed, and every significant transfer received the kind of scrutiny Gordon had spent years assuming would never occur. The Cayman account attracted exactly the sort of attention I had predicted it would, and on the advice of my own tax counsel, I was completely transparent regarding what I knew and when I had learned it. Fortunately, that timeline worked in my favor. The truth was that I had not known very much until relatively recently. What I had known, however, I had documented carefully. Meanwhile, Gordon's professional life began unraveling almost immediately after the dinner. True to his word, Mr. Park spoke with several colleagues in the cross-Pacific investment community. He never launched a public campaign, never made accusations, and never attempted to destroy Gordon professionally. He simply shared his observations when asked. In business circles, especially those built on trust and reputation, that was more than enough. Within 6 weeks, 3 major transactions Gordon had spent years cultivating quietly disappeared. Meetings stopped being returned. Calls went unanswered. Potential partners suddenly became unavailable. Toronto is a large city until someone needs it to become very small. Then it shrinks remarkably fast. Brianna lasted until February. Apparently, she had believed Gordon's promises about the future. She had believed there would be more money, more security, and a far more comfortable lifestyle waiting for her once the marriage ended. As it turned out, the financial reality she inherited looked considerably different from the one she had been sold. She left. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Gordon had treated loyalty as something other people owed him. In the end, he discovered how fragile loyalty becomes when it's built entirely on expectations. When the final settlement was approved, I received the Oakville house free and clear. After the forensic accounting was completed and the court reviewed the concealed assets and transfers, I was awarded 53% of the remaining marital estate, along with a substantial lump sum payment. Margaret later described the outcome as a reflection of the court's profound dissatisfaction with Gordon's financial creativity. That description struck me as unusually diplomatic. I was 64 years old when everything became official. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't interested in being wealthy. I was comfortable. Most importantly, for the first time in more than 3 decades, every decision on my calendar belonged entirely to me. The adjustment took time. For several months, I would occasionally wake up and experience a brief moment of confusion before remembering that I no longer needed to account for another person's schedule, moods, preferences, or expectations. The sensation felt strange at first, but gradually it became one of the greatest luxuries I had ever known. I began accepting only the translation projects that genuinely interested me. Legal work remained a significant part of my practice, though I increasingly focused on specialized assignments where precision mattered more than volume. Without Gordon's constant dismissal hanging over every accomplishment, I found myself enjoying the work again in a way I hadn't experienced for years. One afternoon, while organizing old files in my office, I came across notebooks from my university exchange program in Seoul. The pages were yellowed with age. Some of the ink had faded. Yet as I flipped through them, memories returned with remarkable clarity. I remembered crowded subway platforms, tiny restaurants hidden in side streets, long conversations that stretched late into the night. Most of all, I remembered the young woman who had boarded a plane alone because she was curious about the world and confident enough to explore it. Somewhere during my marriage, I had stopped seeing her. The divorce didn't create a new version of me. It simply allowed me to find the old one again. Around that same time, I received an email from Mrs. Park. The subject line was short, professional, direct, yet it would end up changing the next chapter of my life completely. And it all began with a coffee meeting neither of us had expected to matter quite so much. The morning after the Shangri-La dinner, I met Mr. and Mrs. Park for coffee, exactly as they had suggested. We sat in a quiet lounge overlooking downtown Toronto while the city slowly came to life beneath a gray autumn sky. The conversation began with mutual apologies, though it quickly became clear that neither of us truly believed an apology was necessary. Mrs. Park put it best. There was no deception, she said. Only silence. I thought about that statement often afterward. Silence is not a lie. It is simply the absence of a truth that no one cared enough to ask for. Before we parted that morning, Mrs. Park handed me a business card. Her museum foundation in Seoul was preparing a major exhibition that would eventually travel to the Art Gallery of Ontario. The project required someone capable of overseeing English and French translations for the exhibition catalog and related materials, and she wondered whether I might be interested in discussing the possibility. I was interested. Very interested. That first contract led to another. Then another. Before long, what had begun as a single conversation over coffee evolved into one of the most rewarding professional chapters of my life. The following spring, I found myself boarding a flight to Seoul for the first time in nearly 40 years. The city had changed almost beyond recognition. The skyline was taller, the streets were busier, entire neighborhoods had transformed. Yet beneath all those changes, something familiar remained. I felt it the moment I stepped out of the airport. For 3 weeks, I immersed myself in a city that had once helped shape the person I became. I visited old neighborhoods, wandered through markets, and spent hours walking streets I had not seen since my early 20s. One morning while riding the subway between Sinchon and Hongik University, emotion caught me completely off guard. I sat quietly in my seat and cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to mourn the years that had passed, and to honor the young woman who once promised herself she would never forget this place. The remarkable thing was that she hadn't forgotten. She had simply been waiting. My daughter joined me during the second week of the trip. Watching Elise experience Seoul for the first time became one of my favorite memories. We explored museums, visited neighborhoods I remembered from my student days, and spent an afternoon eating tteokbokki from a crowded food stall in Myeongdong. At one point, she sat back studying me with an expression I couldn't quite identify. Finally, she laughed. "Mom, you're incredible." I shook my head. "No," I replied. "I'm just late." The words made her laugh even harder. But they were true. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was simply arriving at myself later than expected. The years that followed settled into a rhythm I genuinely loved. I continued consulting on a handful of major translation projects each year, enough to keep my mind engaged without overwhelming my schedule. The Oakville house remained my home, though it felt entirely different now. Without tension quietly occupying every room, the place seemed brighter somehow. I adopted a golden retriever named Barley. He was spoiled beyond reason. I have no regrets about that. Elise and her husband welcomed a daughter the following spring. To my great surprise and amusement, they named her Margaret. Officially, they claimed the inspiration came from my lawyer, Margaret Chan, whose work had changed the course of our lives. Unofficially, I suspect the name carried more than one meaning. Either way, I was deeply touched. I began flying to Vancouver every couple of months, and those visits quickly became the highlight of my calendar. Watching my granddaughter grow reminded me that life continues moving forward, regardless of how long we spend looking backward. As for Gordon, our paths crossed only once after the divorce. About 18 months later, I saw him standing in the cereal aisle of a Loblaws in Port Credit. He looked smaller, older, less certain. For a moment he seemed surprised to see me. Then he opened his mouth as though he intended to say something. I simply nodded politely. The kind of polite nod you offer a stranger who may have mistaken you for someone else. Then I continued walking. I was buying blueberries. They happened to be on sale. Today, at 65, I still think occasionally about the drawer I kept closed for so many years. The drawer where I stored my language, my experiences, my confidence, and all the pieces of myself that seemed easier to hide than defend. For a long time, I believed those parts had faded from neglect. I was wrong. Languages do not disappear because they go unspoken. Dreams do not disappear because they go unattended. And women do not disappear because other people fail to see them. If there is one thing this chapter of my life taught me, it is that silence and weakness are not the same thing. Sometimes silence is patience. Sometimes silence is observation. Sometimes silence is a woman listening very carefully while the truth reveals itself. I listened for 31 years. Then I spoke. And not once, not for a single day since have I regretted the order in which those things happened. Looking back now, I don't think the most important thing that happened that night was speaking Korean at the dinner table. It wasn't watching Gordon's expression change or hearing Mr. Park refuse to do business with him. Those moments mattered certainly, but they weren't the real turning point. The real turning point happened years earlier, though I didn't recognize it at the time. It happened every time I chose silence over conflict, every time I folded a part of myself away because someone else found it inconvenient, and every time I convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than being fully seen. By the time I finally spoke, the decision had already been forming inside me for decades. For a long time, I believed I had lost something during my marriage. I thought the young woman who boarded a plane to Seoul with a suitcase and more courage than common sense had disappeared somewhere along the way. What I eventually learned is that she was never gone. She was waiting patiently beneath years of compromise, responsibility, and self-doubt, trusting that one day I would remember where I left her. These days, when I sit in my Oakville kitchen with Barley sleeping at my feet or hold my granddaughter in my arms, I don't spend much time thinking about Gordon. I think about possibility. I think about second chances. I think about how many people quietly underestimate themselves because they've spent too long living inside someone else's expectations. If this story has a lesson, it's a simple one. Never assume that the most important part of you has disappeared just because it has been silent for a while. The things that make you who you are don't vanish when they go unused. They wait, patiently, faithfully, ready for the moment you decide to reclaim them. I listened for 31 years because I wasn't ready. Then I spoke because I finally was. And sometimes that is exactly the right order.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful. Love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.